I'm going to demonstrate how to make a bail solder. Some of you refer to it as the purse, but it's actually called a bail, and it's the little hanger that's on a pendant on a necklace or on a chain, because a pendant is separate from the necklace or the chain that it's on, and what we have to do is make the little connection where the chain can go through. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take my pliers and I'm going to curve like a little U into this piece of wire. Then what I'm going to do is take the cutting pliers and I'm going to cut that off, and notice how I grabbed it so that it didn't go flying everywhere, because if you cut it off and it is free, it will literally go flying everywhere. I'm going to actually even cut this a little smaller because I made it a little bit too large as I was doing that. So I've got my little piece of wire here, and I'm actually going to set it down because it's too big for my hand. So hopefully you can see that's right there. What I need to do after I'm done cutting it is I'm actually going to file the ends of this piece of wire in order to make them flat, because again, as we're soldering, we have to make a flush connection. And what that means is that one item needs to butt right up next to another item, and it needs to be completely flush with no gaps between it in order for it to solder. So I'm going to actually continue to file this, because as I was doing that, I didn't finish filing. And basically what I'm doing is I'm trying to get the little pinched off part from where I used that cutting pliers, and I'm trying to make it really, really flat. So now that I've done that, I'm going to make sure that it's completely flat and that it actually matches up with my piece of metal that I'm going to put it on. This is the easier way to put a bail on a piece. Some pendants actually, and I'm going to bend another piece of wire to show you what that would look like, but some pendants actually have like a teardrop shape, but you actually have to solder this together first and then put it on the piece, and it takes a little bit more time. So I'm going to show you the easier way first, and then later on, if you're curious about that, we can ask the instructors again. So I'm going to take my piece. I've actually filed that. I need to take a look at my end. This end is actually pretty nice and flat. I'm just going to sand it a little bit on the end, and I'm also going to take my piece of sandpaper. The sandpaper is a little too big, so I'm just going to rip it in half so that I can manage that a little bit easier. And I'm going to just, again, sand this piece so that I don't have any fingerprints or dirt on the piece of metal that I'm trying to solder. And I really only need to sand right now the part that I'm going to solder. I'll actually sand the whole thing later when I'm in the finishing process. And as I'm doing this, I'm going to set it in the top of my tool container with the flux brush and with the solder, because I'm going to take that over to the soldering booth in a moment. Then I'm going to actually put that little piece of wire inside the sandpaper, and I'm going to just kind of sand back and forth on this so that I get all the dirt and fingerprints, or finger oils technically, off of my piece of metal. And then I'm going to pick it up with the pliers, because what you'll see hopefully inside here is there's a bunch of dust in here. I don't want to just dump it in there, because then I've got dust everywhere also. So now that I have my pieces prepared, I'm going to take this over to the soldering booth, and I'm going to show you how to solder these together. So one other thing I want to point out with the metal is I actually have 18 gauge brass and an 18 gauge piece of wire for this project. I would suggest using that when you practice. Another thing that you need to be aware of is I'm actually using hard solder. Just like before, there's 4 different types of solder. There's hard, medium, easy, and extra easy, and we're going to use hard because hard technically melts at a higher temperature, and we always start soldering with hard solder first. So I'm going to take my entire top of my toolkit over to the soldering booth, and I do have my flux brush and my solder. Oh, one other thing I forgot is I do need to, even though I did sand this, I don't know if I've touched it in between because I've been doing other things. So I'm actually going to go back and sand the solder again, and notice how I moved over away from all the other stuff. I don't want to get any dirt on my pieces. So I'm going to actually put that piece of solder there, and now I'm ready to move over to the soldering booth. So for soldering the bail, I'm going to need a heating brick. I want to have the heating brick on top of the metal of the soldering station because this actually is going to hopefully not get this too hot and it won't burn you. But I can see I've got a lot of extra stuff on my fire brick here. So what I want to do is I'm actually going to take a scraper, and these scrapers are actually over by the sink. And I'm just going to scrape off the excess flux that is on here. Oh, and you know what? As I'm doing this, I should actually have on my safety glasses because getting flux in my eyes would be a really, really bad situation. Again, I have my hair tied back because as I'm getting ready to solder, I want to make sure that I'm protecting myself. So now that I've cleaned off my fire brick, I want to make sure that I'm taking any of the refuse and I'm putting that into the garbage. And I'm also going to actually sweep out the soldering booth itself. If it really bothers me, I could also go ahead and scrape parts of the soldering booth. Okay. So again, I'm about ready to solder. I made sure that I have on my safety glasses. I've got my hair tied back. I don't have any loose clothing on. And that actually includes hoodie straps. If you've got a hoodie on, you can still wear the hoodie, but you might want to tuck the little pull strings inside your neck just so that they're not out where you could potentially accidentally set them on fire. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my piece of metal, and notice how I'm touching it where I don't want to be soldering it so that I keep it nice and clean. As I have that in my hand, I'm going to take the flux brush, and I'm also going to grab the solder, and I'm going to technically put a little bit of flux on this, and I can actually even just, whoa, that was a little bit more than I wanted, but that's okay. So what I'm going to do, oh boy, I'm going to put a little bit of that in my tool top container, and I'm going to actually wash that out a little bit later because I took a little more flux than I wanted. So there I've fluxed both sides again of my piece. I'm then going to pick up my little piece of wire. I'm going to also flux that, and I'm going to line those pieces up together. Again, I want to have that be as flush as possible, and I can see that there's a little gap between the piece of metal and the fire brick right now, so I'm going to move it over. That's part of the reason that I scraped the flux off of the fire brick, but I had to find a place on this fire brick that was actually level enough for me to do that, because I can see there was still a little bit of flux up here, and it made it so that it wasn't going to solder together. You have to make sure that it's completely flush. That means that it has to lie flat on the fire brick as well. So as I continue to do this, I've sanded my solder, and I'm going to take a tin snips now, and I'm going to actually cut 2 to 4 pieces. And the reason I'm cutting 2 to 4 pieces is that if I make a mistake, that way I have a couple extra pieces of solder that I don't have to take a break from what I'm doing. Okay, so now that I'm ready to cut my solder, I've sanded it. I'm holding it on a side where I'm not going to touch the little pieces that I'm cutting. Technically, I would cut it up the long way first, and I've got a couple that I've cut up like that already from a previous solder that I've done, and I'm just going to cut across these, and I'm going to cut, when I have, they're really tiny pieces right here, I'm going to cut just a couple more just because I think that that might be too small for what I want to try to do right now. So I'm going to cut just a couple, maybe only 2. I have to be real careful. They're a little bit bigger when I cut those next pieces. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my tin snips away from there, because again, that's something that could burn, so we don't want that in the booth as we're soldering. Similar with the flux and the flux brush, I'm going to put the flux over here because I don't need that anymore. And then I'm just going to pick up the solder with the flux that's on my flux brush. I'm going to put it onto my piece, and then I'm just going to gently nudge that piece of solder over to where the gap is between those 2 pieces. I picked up a second piece, and then I'm going to again just slide that little piece of solder over between the gap. And the reason I'm actually putting it kind of over the gap, I'm not putting it between the gap, I'm putting it over, and as I'm heating, it's going to melt and go through. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my top of my tool tin, I'm going to put it over at the table, just so that I'm out of the way and nothing in here could be set on fire. I'm going to then eventually light this torch, and I'm going to heat just the piece of metal that is the larger of the two. I want to point the flame at this square or this rectangle of metal, and part of the reason I'm pointing it at the rectangle and not at the wire is if I use too much heat, I could accidentally melt this wire, and then I would have to start over. So when I heat this, what you're going to see is I'm spending most of the time heating this rectangle. Eventually I will go over to the wire, but it's going to take a little bit of time. I also, as I'm heating with the torch, I want a flame that is about 2 inches long, and it's because this piece of metal is large enough that I have to have enough heat in order to get that solder to do what it's supposed to do. The reason I explain this is I'm going to put on the vent, and I'm not quite sure if you're going to be able to hear my voice for the next part. So I'm going to turn on the vent. And now I'm ready to solder. So I'm going to turn on the red knob first, get the striker to cooperate, and I've lit my flame. Then what I want to do is I'm going to take my flame, and again, I am going to just gently dry the flux on here until it bubbles up white, so that the solder sticks to where it needs to be as I'm trying to get this piece to solder together. And again, the solder technically acts like a permanent glue between the two pieces of metal. It's not glue. Solder is actually metal. It just melts at a lower temperature than the base metal that we're trying to put together. So now that I've got my piece fluxed, and hopefully you guys can see this too, it fluxed much better where I had sanded it, and where I didn't sand it and where there was oil and dirt, the flux didn't actually stick. That could be a potential problem with fire scale later, so you really want to make sure that you're sanding like more of it than you need to. It's really only essential to sand where it's going to solder, but this could be a problem later in my nice piece that I'm trying to make. So now I'm going to actually make this flame a lot bigger, and it's a lot louder, you'll notice, and it's a tighter flame here. I've got like this cone flame. The hottest part of this flame is technically this tip that's right here, and I do need to be careful. Now that I've like touched this tweezers to this flame, I don't want to touch that with my fingers, so I need to be real careful and think about what I'm doing as I'm heating different things. So here I'm going to mostly heat this square of metal, or technically it's a rectangle of metal, and it is brass, and I'm just like kind of going a little bit closer with my face toward the piece. I'm still about a foot away, but I just need to see what I'm trying to solder. And I can see also my solder moved. So I want to, and I'm going to have to, like, with the heat and with the tweezers at the same time, move it. If I don't move while I'm heating, the flux solidifies, and then I won't be able to move my piece of solder where I want it. And I can just see I picked that up. I can see what's going to happen here is this side on the left, or on the top from where you are, is going to solder first, and I may very well have to come back and redo that right side because I lost that little piece of solder that was on that side. There we go. There you can see it melt. Then what I want to do is, I need to heat while I'm trying to move my piece of metal because the flux will solidify. And here I can actually see that it's went through to the back side. So this is a good solder. Oh shoot. And here's what I'm talking about. Like right now I moved the heat and it got stuck, but as it cooled, it will release for you. What I want to show you too is it did solder on both sides. Sometimes if you are not clean enough, you may have to pickle in between in order to actually get your piece to solder again. Sometimes we just make mistakes and we have to redo things. That's just what happens with human beings. Sometimes we make mistakes and we'll have to redo. So I'm gonna take this, I'm gonna quench it. And then you heard the little sizzle. And then I'm gonna actually take this over to the pickle, put it in the pickle, and then I can actually clean it up. Again, when I'm finished with this, I should just see one tiny little line in between the wire and the metal. I don't wanna see all of that extra solder there. That should be gone. So you'll have to take a file and sandpaper and sand that off until all you see is brass here and a tiny little line in between. Okay, one other thing I wanna talk to you guys about is if we are forming brass or nickel, we do need to let it air cool. Forming or texturing brass or nickel, we would need to let this air cool. But since I'm not texturing or forming this piece, I can quench this. It's completely fine. If you are not forming or texturing, you can quench brass or nickel.